From Skadden, you're listening to The Lobby Bar, a political law podcast where we strive to make political law accessible, and hosts Charlie Ricciardelli and Tyler Rosen deliver practical insights on the compliance challenges and regulatory developments that matter to legal, compliance, and government affairs professionals across all industries.
Hi, I'm Charlie Ricciardelli.
And I'm Tyler Rosen.
We're partners in political law at Skadden Arps in Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Lobby Bar, our inaugural episode of a political law podcast. In all full disclosure, the firm came to us and asked us to have a podcast, and it turns out they're interested in political law, we're interested in political law, but really I think part of the issue is that we are the only people left who don't have a podcast, at least over the age of 14. So here we are. Tyler, do you want to do a little bit about what we plan to do here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we thought it would be a good opportunity to chat about political law, which is something that we both love doing. And it's pretty interesting. I mean, as far as areas of the law go, and hopefully you all find it interesting and enjoying too, in which case we'll keep doing it.
Yeah. So the plan here is to pick apart different components of political law that we find particularly interesting. Obviously, any developments that we think folks should know about, or again, just things that we think warrant a deeper dive. And so today's episode, we've picked Battleground 2025, for lack of a better title, where we're going to unpack some unique political law issues that the companies are facing, frankly, in this off-year election, specifically in Virginia, New Jersey, and New York City.
That's right. So we're going to get deep into the platforms of the candidates. We're going to hear about what they're running on, and then we're going to wrap it up with Charlie's choices, the big Ricciardelli endorsement that everybody's looking for.
Exactly. So we're absolutely doing none of those things for any number of reasons, not least of which is it's kind of hard to imagine or hard to conjure anything less valuable than my political hot takes or predictions, and certainly endorsements. More seriously, we obviously, relish the fact that we're a nonpartisan practice. So if you came here for hot political takes, unfortunately, you're probably going to have to make do with mildly amusing, hopefully, political observations and deep dives into political law. So what we do want to do, however, is talk about some common themes that we see in the off years in, again, Virginia, New Jersey, and New York City.
That's right. And the thing that New Jersey, New York City, Virginia all have in common, of course, is they're all places where Charlie has lived.
This is true.
Which is why we picked them.
More specifically, they all have pay-to-play rules.
Oh yeah.
So I think, although I have lived in all those places, I think the audience may be slightly more interested in us unpacking the pay-to-play rules in those jurisdictions. Political law never takes a year off, right? Again, just because we're not in a quote-unquote election year, these off-year elections have potential pay-to-play implications. So let's talk about them. And we're going to unpack them in turn. We'll talk about New Jersey, we'll talk about Virginia, and we'll talk about New York City, and we'll talk about how these laws are a little bit different, and then try to wrap a little bit of a bow on it at the end with kind of a so what. What should folks be doing about these laws, these and others, obviously. But why don't we start, and I'll just kick it off by level setting with what pay-to-play laws are. I suspect if you clicked into this podcast, there's a decent chance you have an idea, but maybe not. And hopefully we've got some, right, exactly. We may have some new listeners. So when we talk about pay-to-play laws, specifically what we're about to talk about are strict liability pay-to-play laws, which are, a raft of federal, state, and local laws that can interfere or prohibit a company from doing government business as a result of political contributions made by the company, made by its PAC, and even made by some personnel, employees, officers, directors. And these are strict liability in nature. Yeah, unlike under bribery statutes or honest services fraud, there doesn't have to be any connection to a government decision or trying to get a contract, right? There's got to be no corrupt intent behind them. They are really foot-fault laws where if you make a contribution, even with the best of intentions, motivations, purely personal contributions, you can trigger application of one of these pay-to-play rules. And what does triggering that mean? In a lot of jurisdictions, it is an automatic timeout on entering into government contracts, or under the federal rules, for example, the SEC rule, a ban on accepting compensation for doing the business. So really serious penalties, obviously, right? For companies out there that are doing a lot of state and local government business, this is a big deal, right? Because it can knock you out of those contracts. They don't all work that way, but that is sort of the common theme. And even if there isn't a specific provision that knocks you out of business, that's always lurking in the background as a possible repercussion for violating them. So we'll step through all of that. But while I have, in fact, it's true, lived in New Jersey and Virginia and New York City, Tyler is sort of born and bred in New Jersey. So I'm going to let him unpack the vagaries and mysteries of New Jersey pay-to-play for a little bit.
Yeah, I am a born and bred New Jerseyan. So anything that I say about New Jersey, over the next few minutes that may seem derogatory, it's coming from a place of love. So, New Jersey has one of the older bodies of pay-to-play laws that are out there, and they date back to the mid 2000s. And like a lot of pay-to-play rules, they emerged out of corruption scandals. New Jersey's sort of had some colorful ones over the years, and at this time, there was an investigation, into folks around the governor. The governor at the time was recorded on a wire using the word Machiavelli with a businessman. And the allegation, which never ultimately was charged and prosecuted, the allegation certainly in the press was that was the code word that meant the pay-to-play scheme was on. Now, I did some reading in preparation for this podcast, and apparently, defenders of the then governor say that he was just really into Machiavelli, and like there was a decent chance that in any given conversation he might just talk about Machiavelli because he's into Florentine political philosophy, and so But anyway, upshot is we ended up with pay-to-play rules in New Jersey, and we ended up with a lot of them. New Jersey, little known fact, is the state with the highest population density, and for many years it was also the state with the highest pay-to-play law density. Under state law, every local jurisdiction was supposed to have its own pay-to-play rule. Most of them did, but finding them was like a whole ordeal. They actually were supposed to send a copy of their pay-to-play rule into the state Department of Community Affairs. And so there was this Department of Community Affairs website with like old scanned copies of faxes of, Haddonfield Township's pay-to-play rule and whatever. And sometimes it didn't match up with what was actually in the county or city code online. It was a whole maze to wander through.
It was as close to having to actually go to the Department of Community Affairs and like pour through their files as you could actually do online. It was not efficient.
That's right. And then in 2023, the state relieved us of this obligation that amended the campaign finance law in a bunch of different ways. One of which was to negate all of these local pay-to-play rules. So now we're down at least into in the single digits of pay-to-play rules in New Jersey instead of several hundred. So let's talk through those pay-to-play rules and sort of focus on some of the bigger ones as an example. The main one that we sometimes refer to as like the vendor pay-to-play rule or the main ban type pay-to-play rule is under something called Chapter 51, which is significant for contributions to the governor, to the lieutenant governor, and for the candidates for both of those offices. Prior to 2023, it was broader. It covered contributions to the state party, to the legislative leadership committees, and it was sort of a bigger thing. But even still, it covers the governor now. And in terms of the covered donors who are whose contributions implicate this rule, it's like a little bit like the kind of Bill Hader Stefan character, from Saturday Night Live.
I'm sorry.
You look confused.
I realize this is a podcast, and my shaking my head isn't going to get it done. What? Yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know if I'm dating myself or if I'm just sort of revealing myself to be not particularly interesting, or both.
I think it's more.
I don't know who that is.
It's more the latter. It was like a SNL character awesome. from like 10 to 15 years ago. He was like the club. New York City club kid, basic archetype, who would be brought on as a recurring character onto Weekend Update to give updates about, the
Oh,
places where
okay.
tourists should go.
Is this
So
like an evolution of the Night at the Roxbury
a
guys,
little
but like in New
different,
York?
but
Okay.
maybe like, I don't know, it's a
All right.
different generation.
All
But
right. Sorry. Go ahead.
anyway, his whole thing would be like, in this case, be like, New Jersey's hottest club is Chapter 51. It's got everything. You've got the covered owners are the company and subsidiaries, 10% owners and officers of a corporation, partners of a partnership, members of an LLC, shareholders and officers of a professional corporation, proprietors of sole proprietorship, PACs controlled by any of those. And then for any of the individuals, their spouse, civil union partner, or resident child.
I'm not sure Bill Hader made this much more fascinating to go through covered donors.
Yeah, I mean, you can, most of the things that he would include at these clubs, are not things that we can talk about on
This is fair.
a law firm podcast.
Yeah.
But anyway, the point is, it's a bunch of different people, and it depends on the type of legal entity that is doing business with the government, and so. It's a broad law, and it's a specific law in terms of what it covers. The New Jersey, this Chapter 51 generally has a $200 de minimis exception, and the way that works is it exempts out contributions that are not reportable or not itemizable under New Jersey's campaign finance law, which is $200. And the thing is that it can result in a ban on business, just as Charlie said earlier. And that ban can last for a long time. The default is for it to last 18 months. But if the contribution is to a successful candidate for governor, then it actually lasts through the term of that governor. So if somebody gave, to one of the gubernatorial candidates that's running right now, if they gave in the spring, for instance, and that candidate wins, the company is knocked out of business, all the way through 2030, the January 2030. When the governor's the soon to be governor elect's term ends. So it's a pretty long tail on a political contribution that might just be $250. The second rule that's worth talking about, I think, and it's sort of split. It's now two rules. For a long time, we always thought about it as the State Investment Council pay-to-play rule. Now there's also the police and firemen's retirement system rule, since New Jersey started an additional state pension fund. And the rules there are basically the same. And there it covers a totally different group of covered donors. All of my officers and directors and all that. It's different. The term that these rules use is imps, which actually does sound like something that would have been in the Stefan sketch. But imps is just short for investment management professional. Which means a few different things. It means somebody who solicits pension fund business. It means somebody who's involved in providing investment advisory services to a New Jersey state plan. Certain management personnel as well. But the point is, it's a different universe of people. Maybe with some overlap from what you have under the Chapter 51 and also under the federal pay-to-play rules. The rule, has a totally different de minimis exception too. It's $250, but only if you can vote for the candidate. If you can't vote for the candidate, and it applies broadly, to any state candidate, even legislators, and to state party committees and the like. If you can't vote for the candidate, there is no de minimis. So, even investment advisors that have robust frameworks for dealing with the SEC pay-to-play rule, would find gaps, when it comes to the State Investment Council and the police and firemen systems rules. The other rare thing for a state pay-to-play rule that you see with the SIC piece is that there's a look back. Most state and local pay-to-play rules just cover contributions by somebody who is at the time of the contribution covered, however covered is defined under that law. The State Investment Council and firemen's and police and firemen's rule, covers somebody up to 12 months prior to their becoming an imp. And so it creates a challenge for companies that are moving people, either into an imp role or hiring, when they could become an imp, that they're thinking about those contributions. The next pay-to-play rule in our tour of New Jersey pay-to-play rules is the redeveloper executive order. And this one, look, I mean, as a New Jerseyan, I think it's important just to be blunt about what it is. It is a rule that is specifically designed, it's an executive order specifically designed to cover or to address corruption in the redevelopment of toxic waste sites and other sites in need of environmental remediation. I think like historians, they look back at laws that a society enacts, as a reflection of that society. And I mean, I guess you could look at it the other way and say, at least New Jersey was tackling this problem and not letting that corruption fester. But it's a commentary, I think, perhaps on my state of birth. And that one is in some ways pretty similar to Chapter 51, but it addresses that specific type of government interaction, these redevelopment agreements for those properties in need of remediation. There's also Chapter 19. That covers all sorts of other piece of it for school boards and local jurisdictions. It's less of an issue usually for companies because it only applies to contributions by the company itself and its 10% owner. So it's a sort of a narrower rule in terms of the covered donors. And then finally, the last piece of what New Jersey has in pay to play is a reporting requirement. Separate and apart from these bans, there's a Chapter 271 which gets at disclosure of political contributions. And that has two parts. One is a certification and disclosure requirement at the time of being awarded the contract and tied to a specific government contract. And then it also has an ongoing annual report, which is filed with the state ELEC, the state campaign finance regulator, called Form BE, where you may have to report contributions. And what's interesting about that is it is just a disclosure requirement. And so on some level, you could say, well, gee, we just need to track this stuff and then we'll report what we need to report. The challenge is that if a company actually has reportable contributions on Form BE, it has an obligation then to itemize the contracts that it has with state and local government in New Jersey, which for some companies is not a big deal, but it actually can be quite a task, to try to identify all of those contracts and report them. It also, covered donors, again, are slightly different. It covers directors. It has a specified definition of officer with component elements of that. So again, it's just another overlay and complication in thinking about how to evaluate contributions in New Jersey. To put a bow on it for New Jersey before we give it to Charlie for the other jurisdictions, I'm struck by the Hamilton line. Everything's legal in New Jersey. I think Lin-Manuel Miranda, very talented at a lot of things, not an expert on New Jersey pay-to-play law, because very little is legal in New Jersey when it comes to political contributions by firms that are doing government business. And it's a real thing there, I would say. It's a thing that the agencies are very attuned to. They are making you certify in these jurisdictions. It's something that bidders are attuned to. You actually see bid contests in New Jersey where a losing bidder says, well, we lost this bid, but we should disqualify that other bidder because they've violated these pay-to-play rules. It's not like there are some jurisdictions out there where you've got kind of legacy laws from the 1970s that are like, nobody's thought about in a long time. They're like Ozymandias, out there, like in the desert. But the New Jersey's a very, very active jurisdiction when it comes to pay-to-play rules.
Active, and it's a real thicket, which you've already
That's
alluded
right.
to or mentioned, and you really need to make sure you're taking all of the different rules into account, including the reporting piece of this. And it really echoes in other parts of political law as well to make sure that you are applying the right laws. And that sounds simple and maybe obvious, but it isn't all the time, right? When you're talking about gift laws, right? Some people will just go to the general gift law or in the ethics code and forget about specific lobbyist provisions, procurement code restrictions, et cetera. Similarly here, right? And Tyler mentioned this, you're focused on the SEC rule, you could easily lose sight of the SIC rule or these reporting provisions. So you really need to make sure that you're evaluating the requests that come in through whatever pre-clearance program you have in place holistically.
Yeah, we'll get questions, like, give us the bottom line, like what can people give in New Jersey? And it's like,
Right.
there's no answer to that question. It's so fact specific in terms of who the covered donor is and what your business is. And
yeah, that's right. So I'm going to step through Virginia and New York City, much more quickly because they're simpler and there aren't 8 million rules as there are in New Jersey, which is helpful. It does, it sets up a nice counterpoint, right, to Tyler's Hamilton reference, right? When you look at Virginia, and you look at it from a campaign finance perspective, you think, well, man, pretty much everything is legal in Virginia because they don't have campaign finance limits. Corporations can give in Virginia. It's, in that regard, it's a little bit of a free for all. So we're done. We can go home. No issue. No, not so fast. There is a pay to play law in Virginia. It was passed in 2010, but it's very different, and it's different in some meaningful ways. It's not that different in terms of covered donors, right? Some of the same suspects show up here. Contributions by the company, contributions by officers and directors can trigger this rule. In terms of covered recipients, you're looking at giving to the governor. If the governor has a PAC, cabinet secretaries. It's a little bit unusual given that Virginia governors are limited to one term, that the secretaries aren't elected. It makes a little bit more sense when you realize, and here's a fun curveball, it also covers gifts, right? Everything we've been talking about has been in the political contribution space, but don't lose sight of the fact that there are pay-to-play rules that are triggered by providing gifts, right? Things of personal value to public officials, like take them to a baseball game or, dinner, et cetera. So in that context, it makes a little bit more sense. Where it's meaningfully different, however, is you have a little bit less of this sort of crystal ball problem. You can make a contribution in New Jersey and trigger a ban for, frankly, up to 5.5 years. In Virginia, it's different. You actually have to give during a proceeding or during the pendency of a bid under certain laws. So it's circumscribed, right? I mean, it's still, it's still on the books. It's still a legal issue. You still need to be vetting for it, but it's potentially easier to deal with. Although we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But it's at least theoretically knowable. Are we in the midst of a contracting process under these laws? If not, then we don't have an issue under the pay-to-play law. New York City's law is also very different. It's actually quite a bit different in that it's really, it's not an issue necessarily for the company, right? There's actually no legal liability for the company or the donor under this law. It really functions as lower limits for the candidates on accepting contributions. So the way that this works in practice is if you're doing business in New York City, you are supposed to report or disclose your covered donors, so CEO, COO, CFO, people in functional equivalent roles, some employees who have senior managerial responsibility and discretion over soliciting and administering New York City contracts, 10% owners. You report all of them to New York City and they go into a doing business database. And then the candidates are supposed to essentially self-police to make sure that they're not accepting contributions over the limit set by this, quote unquote, pay to play rule, right? And those limits are, relatively low: $400 for citywide candidates, $320 for borough presidents, $250 for city council. Keep in mind, again, this is an area where, and Tyler referred to this when he was talking about the New Jersey SIC rule, you have to be cautious when you're thinking about the federal pay-to-play rules, not just automatically or reflexively overlaying the de minimis under those rules and forgetting about this. But again, it's a meaningfully different regime in that there's no legal liability for you. Somewhat similarly, in Virginia, it doesn't trigger, the rule doesn't trigger an automatic ban on contracts the way New Jersey does, right? So if you think about this, some clients will say, well, gee, that's great, right? There's no actual ban. Is there some way I can sort of, dial down my concern over this or take a different approach to these jurisdictions? The answer to that is no, in my view, right? Because, as I mentioned sort of at the outset, even in the absence of a black letter provision that says, well, if you make this contribution, you cannot enter into contracts, that's always a possible consequence of violating these rules, right? You always may be asked to certify that you haven't made a bad contribution. Competitors, right, may raise this if you're in violation of these pay-to-play rules. And ultimately, you've got to remember, it's within these agencies' discretion whether or not they do business with you. And if you want to make a public official or procurement officer squeamish, a really good way to do that is to violate something that's called a pay-to-play rule, right? Because now they feel like they're implicated. And so again, even if the legal provision isn't there saying you're automatically out of business. Loss of business is a real potential consequence that you need to think about when dealing with these laws. Which, is sort of a segue to the so what section of the podcast, which maybe we'll make that a recurring
So
thing
what?
where we drone on for 15 to 20 minutes about the intricacies of the law.
I
and
like
we finally,
so what?
got to keep people to the end, I hear, is important. So, what are we supposed to do about that? And again, many, if not most of you who've clicked into this podcast, and thank you, probably know this, right? And probably have good policies and procedures in place to deal with this. But just to say it, and again, to level set, the only way to deal with these issues is through some sort of a pre-clearance policy, right? You need to have a requirement where some combination, right, some subset of your employees, maybe all your employees, has to raise their hand and come and get legal or compliance to approve before they and, spoiler alert, some family members make or solicit political contributions, at least in some jurisdictions. Because, once they've made the contribution and the strict liability, trigger is pulled, there's often nothing you can do about it. Some of these jurisdictions, there are limited cure provisions, but as a general matter, you can't get that contribution back. You can't cure it. So there needs to be some sort of policy in place. You need to spend a good amount of time thinking about, who are we going to subject to this preclearance policy? And that's often the hardest piece of the exercise, frankly. Do we want to go broad and make sure we're bringing everybody into the funnel? Is that going to be too burdensome? Do we want to tailor this to the folks who we really think are likely to be covered? So you need to give some thought to that. In addition, give some thought to, are we going to require them to pre-clear everywhere? Or is our sort of footprint so well defined in terms of where we may do business that we can only pre-clear in these jurisdictions? Again,
I've seen clients start to go down that road, and if the rules were all like Virginia or all like New York City, that I think that would be a viable approach. That you say, are we doing business here? And then if the answer is yes, then at that point you pre-clear contributions. The problem is like the New Jerseys of the world, and we pick these states because they have elections right now, but they're also indicative of the types of rules that you see out there. Houston has a rule of law like Virginia. There's lots of places that have a prospective ban like New Jersey does. The challenge with trying to limit the footprint, is it's like the probably apocryphal Yogi Berra quote, predictions are hard, especially about the future. You may not be doing business in New Jersey right now, but if 3 years later an opportunity comes down the road, then the contributions that you were letting go through, become a big problem.
Yeah. And not to mention, this is something I was thinking about when you were talking about the New Jersey reporting rule, which, if you make covered contributions, now you have to disclose detailed information about your contracts. The little secret that a lot of companies have, especially, really in particular, larger or more complex companies, is they may not always know, right, where their contracts are. And like just going through that exercise, I mean, it is knowable they can do it, but there's a serious administrative burden to figuring out, where you have these contracts. And so on the other side of that, if you're trying to get comfortable that you're going to allow a contribution in a jurisdiction because you don't think you do business there, or you're not even going to pre-clear in that jurisdiction, it's really hard to get to a place where you're really confident that like every different component of your company doesn't have a contract, isn't in the middle of they could be about to sign the RFP, that afternoon. And how do you get comfortable with that? So an ounce of, prevention worth a pound of cure type of deal.
It doesn't feel like an ounce of protection, though, when you're explaining to executives or to their spouses, hey, guess what? If you want to make a political contribution, you've got to run it through compliance or legal.
That's true. That's, one of the many times it's nice to be outside counsel where you just say, well, here, this is the advice. Good luck. Although that tends to backfire when you get pulled in to be the bad guy to explain it to the CEO and maybe her spouse. So I think we've covered the off-year elections and the pay-to-play rules in the jurisdictions where I've lived. So thanks, everybody, for joining this inaugural Lobby Bar podcast. We appreciate you tuning in. If that's I don't even know, is that the right phrase for a podcast? in any event, hopefully you will subscribe, continue to listen. We're aiming to do this periodically, hopefully at least every month. So tell your friends, tell your family, and we appreciate you joining us.
And if there's things you'd like to see us address, or you have ideas, the so what or anything else that you'd like us to cover, we're no promises, but we're certainly interested in feedback and ideas that people have.
Yeah, absolutely. And come for the political law and stay for the outdated, almost middle-aged, popular culture references.
We had SNL and Hamlet. It was very New York, New Jersey centric today. Sorry about that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.
Well, thanks all very much.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of The Lobby Bar, a political law podcast. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss any future conversations. Additional information about Skadden can be found at skadden.com.